Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Masculine Wilderness podcast. I'm your host, Tom Perez. I am the founder and CEO of Epic Project. This is a continuing conversation among men and the women that have greatly influenced them and are responsible in so many ways for helping men show up in the world in a healthier version of themselves. And today is just another example of that. I'm really pleased and proud to introduce my friend Zoe Bellatorre, who is a subject matter expert, a lived experience expert, and someone who is deep undercover as one of the kindest people I've ever met and doing some of the hardest work anyone could ever imagine. So Zoe, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself, the work you're doing. Let's just start there.
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's such an honor to be on with you, Tom. And yeah, you're somebody I consider a friend, and this just feels like something we should do every week.
Yeah.
So I am based in Los Angeles, California, originally from the Midwest, and came out here pretty much to start my life over. And here in Southern California, since I came out here, I have a master's of intercultural studies with children at risk from Fuller Theological Seminary, and have worked in the anti-trafficking field for about 10 years and have held a few positions, and now do work consulting with the Department of State and NITEC and speak at conferences and all that kind of thing, but indirectly work with survivors as well.
That degree, I had forgotten that part about your story. Like, that's no slouch master's degree. That's pretty heavy duty. When did you finish that?
I graduated in 2014. So
okay.
It's like, I knew I wanted to get into this work.
Yeah.
But at the time, I didn't know what the field was or how to do it. I didn't know how to do it. So it was, right. At the time, their program has changed a little bit, but since I did it, when I did it, they had classes in human trafficking and classes in gender-based violence and things that would put kids at risk and things like that. So that's kind of why I went that route. But yeah, it kind of helped launch me. The first event I ever planned was with Fuller doing stuff. So it definitely prepared me to work with survivors and work in the field.
So for you right now and kind of day to day or month to month, what is the scope of your work? You said there's consulting. It's not currently like direct service?
I do some direct work with survivors, but I don't, I just have my LLC called You Belong. And that came out of a heart where, and I know we're going to get into this in a little bit, but it came out of the heart of familial trafficking survivors, of which that is my back experience. They often felt like they belonged anywhere. There's no agency, or there wasn't a group of people, a group of survivors that were familial survivors. So oftentimes you'd go to events and there would be people explaining their history or talking, sharing, or doing presentations. And people would often almost always feel like, well, that's not me. I'm just sitting here, and there wasn't a place for them. So that kind of came out of that. I have a desire to start working on a curriculum to be used in specifically for familial survivors, to work for safe homes and other programs like case management programs, because oftentimes when you go through other curriculums, they're so much based on a pimp-controlled narrative that they don't feel like they belong anywhere. So a lot of that came out of that. I do work with the Department of State, do regular trainings for them, and contribute to the Trafficking in Persons report, those kind of things.
That's the big annual federal report that comes out. The TIP report. And that's through the Trafficking in Persons office. And Jessica Crisp and myself recently did a panel with the Department of State on child trafficking. And so things like that. We're developing the SOAR module on familial trafficking that should be out. Hope might even be out by the time this podcast is out. It's been honestly
a long time and lots of reviews.
Yeah.
They're just putting the last animations and all of that on it. So it should be out shortly.
Who would be the end user for that particular training curriculum? Would it be foster care system folks, educators, that kind of a thing, or?
Yeah. And it really anyone, even community members. So there's things for social workers, people working in foster care system, law enforcement, just to understand what familial trafficking is and a few ways to move forward. Teachers, for sure, medical professionals, really anyone that lives and works in a community. Because that's familial trafficking, all forms of trafficking, are going on in every state, in every community, in every city throughout the United States and globally.
Yeah. And hiding in plain sight, wouldn't you say?
100%. Yeah.
Yours was the first voice that I ever heard in my journey into this work that talked about, I think you were the first person that I ever heard say familial trafficking. And I'll speak tentatively for the guys that are listening, but I think a lot of times we hear stories of trafficking, and I know that I thought this way, that's someone's daughter, or son, how could that happen? And it just sounded so dissonant in my ears when we talked. And I think I remember we were together at an event, and this was after the event. We were at our dear friend Lauren's house, sitting in her mom's kitchen. And I think you were sharing some of this with me. That's what I remember. Speaking of hiding in plain sight, I think of all of the scenarios, possible exploitation trafficking scenarios, you talked about pimp controlled trafficking. That's probably the most common and most, I won't say accepted, but that's what people are used to hearing. When you hear someone talk about this happening at the hands of a family member, it's almost too much to comprehend. Mm-hmm. I want to go a little bit in that direction, but kind of before we do, if you could just unpack for us some of the major differences, the things that really differentiate a familial trafficking situation. What are some of the key things that, if you were to recognize them, might make you go, oh, this could be that? What are some of the key variables?
Well, I think to go back a few steps, I think just understanding that at the core of it, familial trafficking is when a family member or a relative or caregiver, meaning could be a foster parent, is the person's trafficker. And it most often is with children. So someone under 18. Now, can include someone who has a disability or an elderly person as well, like somebody who say they have a developmental disability and they're 21 and living at home, and we all know what a developmental disability is. So it could be that, but I think a huge differentiation is that most often this child never goes missing. So they're not a runaway. They're not, or a lot of people don't like that term anymore, but it's not somebody that's even missing from care, whether that's foster care or their own home. And so law enforcement isn't looking for this child, and NCMEC isn't notified. And because they don't go missing, it begins with their immediate family, their mother or father. And it can be other family members as well. I don't mean to say that, but I would also say a significant part is that it's intergenerational. So it's happened for generations. Research indicates that 35% of the cases of familial trafficking are intergenerational, meaning this is what happens to all the children in this family. This is what happens to all the boys. This is what happens to all the girls. So then if you even have another adult in your family, that was the case in my life. It was intergenerational. So when I had people notice what was going on, adults, they just kind of looked the other way because I went through this already. And so that's one thing. The young age of the victim is another thing. So grooming starts very young. The average age of entry for familial trafficking is 4 years old, not 13, not 14, not 16, 4. Yeah. So we're talking this child hasn't even entered school. And oftentimes, in my case, it began even younger than that. It began at 2. So I say that to say it's not like you've had this big foundation of being loved and accepted and even had normal, acceptable like childhood experiences. This was your childhood experience. And there's some markers kind of that your kind of morality and ethics and everything in how you view the world is shaped by 8 years old. So we all know those primary years are extremely critical to a child's development. And not that like in my case, right? Like my father was my trafficker and my grandfather was involved and it started before I could talk. But it doesn't mean that our brains can't rewire and reshape how we view the world. Because I definitely didn't have a typical childhood. And that is a case of many familial survivors that, you know, they've had these kind of, it's just been like, that was their foundational experience. It can happen later, but it often is the primary thing. And it's not a one-off. It's not like, oh, this one person has this horrible family. I mean, statistically, the more studies are starting to be done, the conservative number is 44% of all child trafficking cases are familial trafficking cases. Yeah. And some studies indicate up to 60%. And so that's significant. And it's significant because, I mean, we're here talking about it today, but overwhelmingly, our country's not talking about this. And I think part of that is because it's easier to view someone as like the bad person, right? Like, oh, if you didn't go here, if you didn't talk to this person, if you didn't engage online in social media platforms, or you didn't do X, Y, and Z. And that turns into like victim blaming, right?
It's hard. Yeah, it's hard to victim blame when the victim's 2 years old.
Right, exactly. There's nothing you could have done as a child to have made that not happen. I mean, you just happen to be born into this family. And so you have to kind of rewire that. As far as like indicators, it's not as straightforward as pimp control trafficking because you can have both sex and labor trafficking. But as far as like to this audience, I would say like, and I know that conversation is a little later, but the reality is something I say is a little stronger sometimes, but like the reality is when people and I will make a note that familial trafficking does involve sex and labor trafficking, can be both. But in my case, it was primarily sex trafficking and all sex trafficking. And that it was like when there was a buyer involved, which was all time, it's not like they were like, oh, I didn't know she was 20 years old. I didn't know. Like if you're buying a child, like 4 or 5 years old, this kid isn't wanting this. So it's like, I think we really have to address demand because there is a population, it's not like by mistake, and not that it's okay if somebody's 20 or 25, but there is like people can get away with saying like they didn't know. Right. But
that doesn't exist here.
No. And why is it like even something that someone would think would be acceptable?
Yeah. I wanted to just circle back partially what you said earlier, that just it's such a heavy thing. But why is it, because you've been advocating for a higher level of awareness around this for a long time. Mm-hmm. Why are good people that want to engage, like good organizations, why is there still so much reluctance? I don't know if that's the best word to use, but why is it that this doesn't get, in your mind, why do you think it doesn't get the attention that it deserves?
Oh, gosh. I think like in Southern California, I think there are so many people, when they started identifying trafficking survivors, it was because law enforcement was arresting kids, which doesn't happen anymore in this county, but that were engaged in street-based prostitution. And they were at the time going to juvenile hall, and that's how they started. And all the protocols are around that. So I think it's a lot, I think Hollywood, because it's a lot to like how we viewed trafficking, how we view what exploitation is. And some of the research indicates that people either familial trafficking survivors either never receive any form of criminal justice or the cases are mislabeled. as just child abuse or child neglect, something like that. So then the person who was the perpetrator is never labeled with like pimping and pandering or as a
pedophile. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think too, because it's people want to believe that the kid next door to them, is safe, right? They're safe when they go home with their mother or father. And also people don't want to, in other parts of the world, we have more of a village mentality. We all are taking care of each other. Mother Teresa says, we've forgotten we belong to each other. And that's why, in her quote, she says, like, we don't have peace because we've forgotten we belong to one another. And I'm not like talking about any kind of conspiracy or whatever, but in like parts of Africa and other parts of the world, like they truly care for each other and it's more of a village mentality. And here we're like, go home, shut your door, lock your door, and nobody knows what happens behind closed doors.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the home for children like this is the most dangerous place. And I think too, I would add that like schools have become, you have teachers in your family, but the teachers have so much on their plate right now and so many more kids than they really should have in a classroom that when a kid, for example, like when I went to school, I would dissociate. Like I would sometimes sleep because I was up all night being exploited. And, I wasn't the kid who was throwing a fit. I wasn't the kid who was stabbing another kid with a pencil or doing that. So they're just like, fine, she's not causing a problem. Let's just whatever. Like, it's not like that big of a deal. And so, because, if you have a classroom of 25 to 30 8-year-olds or 7-year-olds, if one's quiet and even falling asleep, sometimes you're just like, that's fine. They're not hitting anybody. And I think too, because a lot of teachers aren't even trained on what human trafficking 101 is, what that kind of thing. And it's not a law enforcement problem. It is, right? Like we do need law enforcement, but it's an everyone problem. It's a take care of your neighbor problem. It's a teachers have to be equipped to see this stuff and respond problem. And
do you think also there's a reluctance to acknowledge the prevalence of this within family systems? Because in American culture, we want to believe, and I want to believe, that the family is still a place where you said where when a kid comes home, they're safe. Like we don't want to admit that even in the family structures and systems, this could exist. Do you think that's part of why people are reluctant?
Yeah, for sure. And, a lot of times the people who are trafficking these kids, like they're in networks. These kids aren't standing in the street corner. They're in some kind of pedophile network or some private club or thing like that. Or there's a number of survivors that have been exploited within a faith-based or high control setting. So it's the reality is we have to kind of take the veil off that says, this only happens when you X, Y, Z, right? And I think we have to go back to more of caring. I think one thing can be you can be, for people that may be thinking are want to lock their kids in their house and never leave.
I feel that.
I think there's a value to being that safe home on the block or that's your street, to being the home where all the kids come over and I live in LA, so I don't have a backyard, but some people do. But they all playing, and they're you always have an extra seat around the table. So when you have that kid in the neighborhood that maybe doesn't feel safe, if you're the safe home, there's still value to having good families and good homes. But I think part of the kind of disconnect has been this hashtag family first kind of mentality where nothing about family comes before everything, which I understand because we are workaholics and all of that. But at the same time, for folks that are being trafficked by their family or have been trafficked by their family, that feels like just a real slap in the face.
Yeah, where can I go? Long before I ever started Epic, I had a sense, and I don't even think it was my original idea, but when my kids were young, when my daughters were in middle school and high school, And my wife was teaching by that time, and I had been a youth pastor for years prior. So I'd been around a lot of families, some good, a lot of really unhealthy, and I knew what could happen. So we had a standing rule in our home. I told all my kids this, that if there was ever a friend like you just described that felt like something was unsafe, our door was always open, and my daughters had the authority to bring kids home and say, this is Jane. She's staying with us for a couple nights, Dad. And I'm like, okay. And obviously my wife was connected with the school and we would know a little bit more about what's going on. But it was a standing rule in our house that, like you said, that this was a safe place, and our children were given that authority to extend that safety to their friends. And the result was we actually had 3 or 4, maybe even 5, if I'm remembering correctly, young women that actually ended up living with us for extended periods of time because of, not that we know of for anything as extreme as familial trafficking, but some really difficult situations at home. All of that to say, I think the hashtag family first thing has its limitations, and it would exclude, and I think that's your point, it would exclude kids like you, the ones, the folks that you have worked with over the years. That breaks my heart. Like I can't imagine knowing, and this is part of the problem, like that I feel like you and I are inflicting on people that are listening. It's like, once you know all this stuff, you're not going to be able to feign ignorance. Like, you're going to have to do something about it. In that vein, can you walk us through, back to the earlier conversation, the differences between like pimp control trafficking and what happens in a familial situation? What usually has to happen for that case to be brought to light? What are the things that typically need to happen in order for that to be any hope of justice, really?
Right. So one thing I think is significant that in my own case, and in the case of multiple survivors I know, many survivors I know, they tried to tell somebody. They tried to tell their teacher or tell law enforcement or tell whoever. And because they were young and they were saying XYZ is happening, and they weren't believed. They weren't taken seriously. They were told, here's a lollipop, go away, go home. Or even when I tried to go to law enforcement, they were like, oh yeah, we don't really do anything with that. And what? I even remember as a teenager asking for like a restraining order or something. And they were like, yeah, come back when he does something again. And I said, well, I'll be dead. Wow. And so I just didn't go back. I have since worked with law enforcement, but like at that time I was like, there's no one will help you. So I think when someone says something like this, they have to be believed. And we have to have increased protocols for even calling Department of Children and Family Services, or in every state, there are a little bit different acronyms. So whatever they're called in your state, like how that proceeds. Because if there has been a call or report and the perpetrator finds out, then the kid has to be removed at least temporarily, because this kid could like die. And I think some of the indicators, it's not like kids aren't going to have a bunch of like multiple cell phones or brandings or things like that. They're most often, because the abuse has happened so early and shaped who they are developmentally and caused the impact of trauma, they're most often reserved or shy. There might be multiple layers of like health implications. They might have somatic complaints, headaches, stomach aches. They might have infections in their throat or other places. And for me, and it's true for many people, they face really severe abuse. Like, and we would refer to that as like grooming, right? So like, it's not, grooming isn't only like kind of this romantic boyfriend who promises the world. It can be like, do this or X, right? Like, you'll have food withheld, you'll have this withheld, it can be that there's use of love, very extreme violence. And you're like, that's too, and you're like, okay, this isn't just someone in a pedophile ring. This is somebody who is not right. Because that kind of, it really shaped me when I started to see good families who like truly love their kids. And when a baby's born, people were rejoicing and stuff. And I'm like, oh, that's different kind of a thing. Like, you all, are helping take care of this young person. And that was a very different reality for me. But I think there's been a lot of cases where these kids are bullied at school, and because the kids can tell something, the other kids can tell something's right or off. And for me, I was told I had a learning disability. There's really the trauma. I didn't find out until I was in grad school, where a professor said, I don't know who told you were stupid, but you are not.
Wow.
I mean, that was 2012.
Yeah. Well, and you're in grad school, so that's a clue right there, right?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't think I could do it. I thought I was going to fail out, but I was like, I didn't know how else to figure out what to do in the movement, because I knew nobody had ever listened to me or believed me. And I knew I wanted to change that for people. I really felt in my heart I was supposed to do something. I just didn't know what or how. So it just kind of gave me the ability. But then when she was one of the first professors I had, and it really helped shape how I viewed myself. But a lot of people are told have a lot of psychological abuse. And it's the same thing with every trafficking survivor. And it doesn't change that the kind of how trafficking happens doesn't change. Right. And I think too, a lot of times this will present people are being trafficked in homes, but also in businesses, and also in motels, and also in adult venues, and also in private parties. So if you see something that just looks off, or why is that happening? It could be worth asking some questions or probing a little deeper, or if you think a kid really is in danger, to call law enforcement or Department of Children and Families.
It seems it would be difficult, because if I'm understanding what you're saying about the indicators of familial trafficking, they manifest, tends to be a younger population where you start to see those things, but they manifest more as behavioral kinds of things that would cause a kid to withdraw, whereas in a pimp-controlled trafficking situation, you might have an older youth, a teenager, he is at the other end of the spectrum. They're acting out. And that's probably the more familiar scenario. So it's you don't even know that's what it is, I think. And I know when you were talking about how kids know that something's off, I could think about kids I knew. I mean, it was a long time ago in grade school and middle school and high school, where we would have just written them off as they're just odd.
Right.
But there's a reason for that. And it might not be this, but it could.
We'll be right back after these messages. The year is wrapping up, and we are so grateful to you, our listeners, for having a heart for ending exploitation. Today, we want to take a moment to ask for your support. This is your reminder that Epic Project is a nonprofit organization. Our mission extends well beyond having the important conversations that you have heard here. Through our disruption program, Epic Project has stopped hundreds of thousands of attempts to purchase illicit sex. Our teen prevention program, My Friends Are Not For Sale, has educated countless students across the U.S. to identify grooming and stay safe from traffickers. Our Hard Road Challenge has raised over $100,000 for survivor-led initiatives, and more. None of that is possible without donations from supporters like you. Please visit epicproject.org/donate to join the fight against exploitation and to support survivors. Thanks for all that you do. And now, back to the show.
Does a parent seem overbearing, or do they seem do they not let the child participate in any clubs or activities or sports? Are they able to do anything apart from, and too, there's familial trafficking survivors who were even homeschooled. So they didn't even have that public school, regular kind of elementary school thing. So if they are homeschooled, then it's the parent is controlling every dynamic of their growth. There's this model that's used in the education sector called Bronfenbrenner's. It's the person who developed his name was Bronfenbrenner. And basically, it's your spheres of who you are, who you know, and who you interact with in the world. And as you get older, those spheres get larger and larger. Right. But when, say you have a 5-year-old, for example, think of any 5-year-old, and they're kind of who is in their world, or who is in their kind of circle, is their biological family, their parents, right? And then if they go to church, those people at church, if they're kindergarten and preschool, like their kindergarten and preschool teacher and neighbors. And that's like it, right? Like the kid isn't like going to Target by themselves. They're 5, right?
Yeah.
So like, and looking at and of course, as you get older, then you start having friends and your friends, families and all of that. But I say that to say like that same circle still applies to familial trafficking. So those are the people that are going to see those indicators, the neighbors, the school teacher, the physician, if they go to a church, mosque, whatever, those people that are there, because people bring their kids to their faith community. I mean, even when they're born, right? So they could see that, but kind of that like kid on the bus who's acting kind of off, like that probably won't happen for another couple of years at least. So you're not going to put your 4-year-old on the public bus by themselves. So those kind of things, I mean, it's why it's like a higher level of conversation.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure. So to that point, what are the necessary conditions for a community to be better able to identify and respond to this kind of victimization?
I think one of the things really is to believe that it happens, step one, and not that it's just like, oh, that crazy family that lives in that big house, they're a little off. Like maybe they're just weird, but it's kind of step one is understanding that this happens, accepting that this happens, and like kind of being on the lookout. And I think too, for the average community person who I think whether you're a coach or you just walk the same couple blocks when you're walking your dog every day, like just being on the lookout, like, is there a home where the kid never is allowed to play in the front lawn or never goes out and just kind of plays or doesn't participate in the local? It's not an immediate like, oh, I see this, I'm going to call like the hotline right away. But it is developing a relationship. It is relational. It is having, the more this child trusts you, the more they're willing to able to talk to you and have connection with you. I think it's also, as far as like, it's empowering our teachers, it's empowering our social workers, it's empowering our medical providers. Like if your kid goes into the ED emergency department and they have multiple infections in their throat, like maybe the doctor wants to talk to them alone and like let them, like you don't have anything to hide, let them, like that's the only way we have to empower these professionals who are more on the front lines. It's even eye contact, right? If you've been taught to not make eye contact unless you're being bought, right? Like that, like you would look down and not make eye contact, not speak to people. If you see a child doing that all the time, like, and the parents are like, oh, they're just shy. That would maybe they are, but maybe there's more to that. So
yeah, I love the step one you said is just be willing to admit that this is a thing. And every time I've talked with you, we've had other friends on this podcast who talked about this and others in the work, and it's such a heavy thing to talk about. I've always respected your sensitivity to that among people who want to be involved and be helpful, and you've always been so wise that way to find that fine line between overwhelming and incapacitating versus just educating what the facts and the reality. What is, on that note, just in terms of the reality, what is the recovery and restoration? What does that look like? Because the trauma and the victimization starts so young and it's such a tender, formative age. Like, what are the likely outcomes? Just be real honest with us for folks that have to endure this level of exploitation. What does that look like?
I mean, I will say that we don't have enough research in this area. So if you're a researcher listening and you want to do research in this area, we definitely need more, especially on the resiliency and recovery end. But I will say there are kids who are trafficked by their families. We don't have the numbers, but they don't make it out alive. Like they die. There's just is another forms of trafficking when you're being bought as an object, even as a young child. People are not caring for your best interest and wanting you to thrive in life. just as in other forms of trafficking, they are purchasing you as if you were a pizza or whatever, right? And some of the buyers, they will totally be violent and do whatever is they would like. So there are folks that unfortunately have not made it to adulthood.
Yeah.
A lot of familial trafficking survivors will not have to work to have a hopes and dreams and kind of future orientation, because among the majority, they would say, I didn't think I was going to make it to 20 years old. Like the majority would absolutely say that. So with resiliency, it is, for one, people have to be believed. And then there's been research done on our brains can heal and recover in post-traumatic growth. You may be familiar with the topic. And I think a lot of that is really critical. There are a significant portion of folks that their brains, and it's not like an active choice when you're being trafficked, but have dissociation. That dissociation was a way they survived. It's just our brain's natural way to like escape an inescapable situation, especially when you're young. And a good amount of, I won't say everyone by any means, but a higher amount of familial survivors have dissociative and identity disorder, live with that because of the severe trauma before age 5, 6, when your brain was developing. And it was extremely severe and traumatic. And the public has made DID be something that has just been super sensationalized in every movie or anything like that. But really, it's just your brain has kind of made these different parts of you that kind of either took the abuse, took the trafficking, or like hid when things were happening. So it's really like you have these people walking around in adult bodies that have all these children kind of parts like in their brain. So, but
that was an adaptive response in order to survive, right?
Yeah. So I think resiliency is making community, having friends. Like that's one of the 5 kind of pieces of that resiliency. But a lot of times when people were being trafficked, when they should have been learning how to make and keep friends, they were being trafficked. So it's like a skill they have to build. Like, oh, when you come in a room and you're at an event, you should say hi to people. Like, because like most people know that, but think like when you're a parent to say a 3-year-old, you say, oh, hi, we're here. Like, say hi to so-and-so. Like
that's when you normally would teach your children.
Learn that. Right. Yeah. But if you're being trafficked during that time, you may not have learned those things. And so you have to like relearn or learn for the first time these fundamental like social skills, for example. And learn that people actually want to spend time with you. They want to be your friend. They want to be around you. You don't have to do anything to make them like so that you will spend time with me. Like just you are enough in who you are. That being in nature helps, like not camping in the woods, but like walking in a park. Step 1, right? Like noticing beauty in our world and realizing like there's one of the tenements of that post-traumatic growth is something larger than itself. So whether that's faith in God or faith in just like there's something bigger than me out there, that is a helpful thing in finding out like, what do you like to do apart? Like, who are you apart from the trafficking, apart from this really horrible thing that happened? Who are you? And I think one of the resiliency things that really people can step into, and it is something that really is hard for folks, is like if they've chosen to disconnect with their biological family because they were the perpetrator, they were the trafficker, we don't ask other trafficking survivors to stay connected to their traffickers. But we do kind of like society kind of is like, well, they're the only family you'll ever have. So if this person is disconnected from their biological family, I would say one of the things is we have to build like a family of choice.
Around it, And because, that's a choice you made in your own story.
Right. It was really a matter of survival for me because I had been nearly killed myself like more times than I can count. And people that see me on the street they had no idea, right? Like they never know. But I got to this point one day when I was actually like sitting in a church and I realized if I don't get out of here, I'm going to die. Like he will succeed It's not going to do. And when I accepted that, and the reality was so right in my face at that point, and I just had to move away. So I had to cut them off because I didn't want, if you tell one person where your address is or where you're living, they're all this interwoven network with each other. It's not going to stay secret. It's not going to be respected because it's just not a healthy dynamic. So I have had to create people around me who are like family and who can be that, but are not biologically related to me. Yeah. So people who, my friends and that kind of thing. And I think we were always supposed to look out for people who experience these kind of things. And I do want to say too, like, this is not some new thing where the world's gone to like hell in a handbasket kind of a thing. Like, this has literally been going on since the beginning of time. Familial trafficking we can trace it back into the Bible. So I just want to like add that piece because it's not, and people have become resilient and strong, and you couldn't get to the point where like I'm sitting here with you now where you don't have some level of resiliency.
Yeah. For me personally, I have a lot of survivor friends, but those that have experienced familial trafficking, it's the most, they're all extreme, but like the strength to do it, the strength to walk away, and no one, like we always want to think, who rescued you? It's like, oh, you rescued yourself. Yeah. And to be able to do that as a victim of familial trafficking requires an even deeper kind of strength. I want to know, like, when you were sitting in that church, how old were you at that point when you had that realization?
Like 17, 18.
So it had been going on
for a long time. And I will say like that with familial trafficking, we do see, and there are cases in other types of trafficking where it goes on for a long time, but typically it goes on for an extremely long period of time. Some people, it will end when they hit puberty, but that was not my case. So
yours is an amazing story, but the issue itself is troubling because it is hiding in plain sight, and it is underreported, it's under-researched, it's under-resourced. Because of all those reasons, do you feel, because you've been advocating for this for a long time, do you feel like there's any positive forward progress?
Yeah, I feel like it's getting some traction. So that piece in the TIP report, the familial trafficking piece that I wrote with the department there, that came out during COVID. I would say it was probably published in 2021, something around there. I remember when they had they usually will have it in DC where they share the report and all that.
Right.
And that was during COVID. The only thing we could do is like join on Zoom. But since that time, more people are starting to pay attention to it. We still have a long way to go. I think in a lot of our service programs, we need to have specific care and services for familial survivors. I run into adult familial survivors all the time who are just like starting to figure out life. Like, and they don't say they move, they escape like I did. Like when I came here, I didn't literally just had some clothes in my car in an old Honda Civic, drove across the country, and I didn't really have anything. So a lot of times, a lot of our service provisions need to be addressed because we have this thing where we're like, okay, if you've escaped trafficking within the last 72 hours, we put you in the safe home. We give you gift cards. We give you things you need. We help you into transitional homes. But a lot of times, because the trafficking wasn't 48 hours ago, they don't get the same help. And even mentorship or peer support, those kind of things, they often don't get kind of the same level of help because they're like, well, we just don't know what to do for you.
And that's what I was going to say. Is it because there's a real gap in understanding some of the differences and the nuances of it?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of times with familial survivors when they're starting to kind of get back on their feet again, whatever age that would be. I've noticed, and this was true in my own case, there's educational gaps. So they need somebody who like could help them. Like when I had graduated, I first was an elementary ed teacher. And when I'd be going over things with children substituting or I had regular classroom, like there were a lot of times if I didn't have that teacher edition, I wouldn't have known the answer. I didn't know my multiplication facts. I didn't know why letters said the sounds I say. I didn't know how I learned to read. I can read, obviously, but like there is a significant amount of people that have experienced this that have significant educational gaps because, say, when they were learning to read, they were dissociated or not there at all because they were being exploited. So I think that's one thing. I think if you're going to have an advocate, then we have to have diversity in leadership. Even when we're saying, okay, we're bringing survivors on boards and on committees and shaping policy and all those things, but is it all the same type of survivor?
Right.
Is it all pimp-controlled survivors? Is it all, do you have a labor trafficking survivor? Do you have a familial survivor? Yeah, we're looking for gender diversity and racial diversity, but we have to have the representation of that, because if we say I'm in a hospital and I'm helping them look for like, these are the things you're looking for in a patient that may present with being exploited, if we don't say like the controlling person could be a family member or they might just be completely shut down too, like that could be an indicator. We're totally, in a lot of things I see being pushed out by agencies and policies, like they're so focused on pimp control trafficking that it totally negates any experience of familial trafficking.
And to be clear, it shouldn't be an either or scenario here. We should be both and. We should be training to recognize both of these kinds of scenarios. It's kind of the market, that's maybe not the best word, but the market and the arena in which funding and resources are allocated, it can be dominated by a scarcity mindset. And if one group doesn't get the funds and resources, it can be devastating. But I think we have to rethink that for all the reasons you talk about, because this is happening. What was the statistic you said? Upwards of 40% or more?
44% is the conservative number.
That's the conservative number. And I think Jewel talked about it on an earlier podcast as a DOJ research, right?
Yeah, some of that. So I'm referring to more recent studies. But
okay.
Yes, DOJ has put some information out there. Like when I wrote the piece for the Department of State at that time, we were citing 31%. But you can see the more light that's being shed on this, the more we see it. The more we see it. And we do see, I would say, almost everybody who was trafficked by family had some type of like CSAM taken of that, what we refer to now as CSAM taken of them. It was either distributed as advertisement or they were put more recently, like people would be put online. And CSAM is the correct technical term for what we used to call child porn, but it's child sexual, what is this test? Child sexual abuse material. Mm-hmm. So it can be any medium that's used to document or capture in a digital form or otherwise and when
abuse.
You think about it, it's like everybody has a smartphone.
Right.
We have cameras in our phones, cameras on our computers. Like back in the day, like not that long ago, people would be using like a big camera,
shoulder-mounted camera.
Right. Yeah. But now it's like people can take high-quality videos on their phone.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say I remember when Lauren took photos of me for like headshot, and there was another survivor there. And the fact she started with her cell phone, she had her camera, but like she also took pictures with her cell phone, really helped bring like the barrier down. And she can tell when like somebody is kind of anxious behind a camera, and she'll like use her phone, and that's less intimidating because people have used that camera. But now
it's universal.
I mean, it's good. Technology is great, but there's always the dark side of technology. And I think like we are so aware of kind of the dark side of it. I think, too, another thing is when we're talking child protection and we're talking a lot of times are like, what can families do to protect their kids? And I think that is valid and needed. And like, I'm all for all the things that a parent can do to protect their kid, because if you haven't experienced this, I don't want no person should go through trafficking, right? Or exploitation. But I think we have to like kind of open the barrier and be like, we have to not just say like, this is outside of the home. We have to realize that this is inside of the home as well.
That is the banner you carry. You know, you were the one that taught me just how important it is for people to know. I have a couple questions just to kind of wrap up. But before we do that, I'm so glad that you live in a beautiful, sunny place. I have done time in Southern California, and I love it. I'm from the Midwest originally, too, and I'm so glad that you get to live and do your work there. And what for you, like at this season of life, has been just life-giving for you? What is outside of all of this? What is life-giving and sustaining for you?
I try to take walks. I live in a very urban area, but, you know, go walking in one of the gardens. We have like a couple really beautiful gardens
That's an understatement.
Just a breath of fresh air, or walking by the beach. I love the water. I love the beach. And you don't have to spend all day. Like, you can just walk along the shore or walk to where you can see the water, kind of a thing. I love a beach community. I had a lot of money, I would live in a beach community. But those kind of things. I also really value relationship and people. Yep. And I really, truly enjoy getting together with people for a coffee or for a meal. I love a good meal. I'm not anorexic at all, but I'm down for...
Nor am I.
Your home cooked meal. I mean, around here, there's really good Latin food. I love it. And like, I really enjoy just that, you know, and when you're there with people, if you ever see me at dinner, I turn over, like if I have my phone, I will flip it over. So I'm not... I've literally watched you do that. Yeah. Because I want to be present with you when I'm with you.
Yep.
So that's something I enjoy. And I love my good relationships with people in the field, but I also really appreciate a few friendships I have that they know nothing. They know very little about trafficking. Yeah. They're not in the field. They just truly like want to spend some time with me or things like that, where it's like you can have relationships that every conversation isn't about trafficking too.
Cool. That's got to feel good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's got to feel good. I want you to have the last word. I wondered if you could give us your best advice to two particular groups of people as we've been having this conversation that keep coming to mind. Teachers who are amongst young kids every day and I come from, like you said, I come from a family of teachers. I know the heart of a teacher, and they are there to love and serve and nurture kids. So that's the first group. What's your best advice to them about how to pay closer attention? And then to young parents who, I'm thinking in particular of my middle daughter, who's a young mom, her and her husband in a community full of young families. They have more of a village sense. Like they're looking out for not just their kids, but the community of children. Like, what's your best advice to teachers and young parents who want to do a better job and have a better sense of what's going on, and to be able to advocate and look out for kids who've had to live through the things that you have had to live through and so many others?
Yeah, I think with teachers, children who are attending school are spending the most time they'll spend with anyone with that teacher during the day, especially when we're talking young children. So teachers are critical to this fight. We don't often, like if we're at a conference together, we don't necessarily see teachers there because they don't have the time to be there. But teachers, they're going to know that child very well. They're going to know if that kid's just having a bad day, they're off, everyone has a bad day, or if this is a pattern, if every time the child spends the weekend with their dad, they come back and they're not right for a day or two.
Yeah.
If every time at 1:30, dismissals at 2, this child complains of a headache. Like something more is going on there. If they have bruises and they are wearing long sleeves and it's hot out, or maybe there are children who never do their homework because they want to play outside, but there are other children who aren't doing their homework because they are being trafficked at night.
Yeah.
Like, is a child falling asleep every day for a couple hours? They're always sleeping through math. Like, those are things that are maybe like harder to notice, but there's something wrong there. And I think one thing too is that they're keeping a lot of secrets. I can't tell you that. I can't share that. If you're going around the classroom and you're like, what did everyone do for Christmas with their families? I was a child who wouldn't say anything because I couldn't tell you what happened.
Right.
And so I think for them, like, if this kid always seems off, I think teachers are like secret warriors in this fight, especially when we're talking child trafficking and really young children under 10. Like, teachers are going to be the person. And I think with young families too, it's that, do you have a family that like they seem extra secretive? You have a family that, like, I think too, teaching children about boundaries and their body and like not being like, you have Uncle Charlie always gets a hug and a kiss and whatever, even if like you don't want to. You're like, you have to be nice to Uncle Charlie because he's old. Like, that kind of teaching kids, like, no, they have autonomy over their own bodies, even at a young age. Like, they can say, no, thank you. Like, be polite, but be like, how about a high five today? Like, those kind of things, I think. And noticing, like, when a child something seems really not right about that family and that child, like, I think asking questions, asking a kid, like, hey, are you okay? Do you feel safe at home? They're not going to know the word trafficking, just like survivors who are adults who are in the healthcare setting. Like, we said our first question to people was, are you being trafficked? 99.9% of people would say no. So I think not using that word, but do you feel safe? Do you get to make your own choices? Do you get to eat when you want to eat? Those kind of things are important. And being that like solid rock, that stable force, that person in the community that people know, like, if we were to have a major problem in our community, I'd go to you because you, not that no one has it all together. Right. We just say, like, nobody does, but there are people that can be found trustworthy, that can be found like a safe shelter almost for kids and adults alike. So I would definitely say those kind of things. I know they aren't super like, do these 10 things and you'll be good. But I think it starts with really getting to know your neighbors, for one. Like, who are your neighbors? Do you know them? Who are the people in your church? Who's that person that doesn't have anyone? Even if they're a kid, they're always by themselves. We're not wired to be that way. So something's not right.
That's so good. That's so good. Zoe Christine Bellatorre, it's such a lyrical name. You are life and life-giving, and you're a blessing. And I'm just so grateful to be in this messy work with people like you. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for making time and space and for all of this.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast with your host, Tom Perez. This podcast is a production of Epic Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to disrupting the demand for commercial sexual exploitation and dismantling the forces that perpetuate it. I'm your producer, Lauren Trantham. Special shout out to our favorite logo designer, Michelle Boucher, as well as Wes Finley, who crafted and donated our amazing theme song. Interested in sponsoring an episode? Send us an email at podcast@epicproject.org. That's podcast@epikproject.org. As a nonprofit organization, your donations allow us not only to produce this podcast and change the conversation around sexual exploitation, but also to manage our many programs, such as buyer intervention, teen prevention, and community education. Your support also allows us to support survivors of exploitation and more. To learn more about our work and to donate, visit www.epicproject.org. Once again, that is www.epikproject.org. Most importantly, this podcast would be nothing without you, the listener. Thank you for tuning in, subscribing, and sharing this episode with your friends and loved ones. Thank you for your commitment to learning more about the issues that affect our most vulnerable populations. Thank you for navigating this masculine wilderness with us. See you next episode.